Today, at this time, we have a follow-on panel, which we call the moral sense, the defining encounter. And what we've asked this panel to do is to talk a little bit about how we know what we know, how we apprehend it and how we comprehend it. And so we have a philosopher, a psychiatrist, a scientist, and a political scientist. And chairing this group is one of our neighbors and good friends, the dean of the graduate school, the Pardee Graduate School of Public Policy at Rand, Susan Marquis. Susan, like some others on our program, comes to her deanship with a strong background in the public sector as well as in the academic world. And there's a little bit of nepotism involved here in that John DiIulio, whom we have pressed into service for this panel, I believe was your professor in working on her own graduate work. So James Q. Wilson was very closely involved with the Rand Institute. He was on their board, worked a lot with some of their students. One of our professors, whom you'll meet later, Angela Hawken, who is in the audience, was a student at Rand and came to the attention of James Q. Wilson. And that close relationship even makes Susan's chairing of this more appropriate. So, Susan, the panel is yours.
Thank you very much. Oh, good morning. Good morning. This is tremendous fun to be here. It's always fun to talk about Jim's work, but mostly to see Jim's friends here. And I'd like to say thank you to Roberta, who was instrumental in helping us establish the James Q. Wilson collection at the Pardee Rand Graduate School. We do have an archive. Jim's papers are at Rand, and it's some of his personal papers, mostly academic papers. I will bring to your attention, if you'd ever like to use the archives, that we have some of Jim's lecture notes. So I was listening to Bill Crystal talk about the course he was taking. We do have some of the lecture notes from those days, and they're great fun to read, mostly how Jim would mark them up, scratch things out, move things around, and it's a pleasure, and we'd be happy to, there's a handout actually in your folder. So if you need more information, would like to have access to the archives, just let us know, and we can arrange that. We have a interesting group of panelists, as Jim was saying, Jim Wilburn was saying, a psychiatrist, a philosopher, a political scientist. I think some of the questions that come up during these 2 days gets at what Jim looked at his entire career. Why do people do what they do? And whether they're bureaucrats or criminals or more broadly citizens, why do we behave the way we do? And so we can talk about what we know, but I think Jim was often interested in how we act. And that's part of what the moral sense brings us to, and I hope it's part of what we're going to discuss this morning. Sally Satel is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, but most importantly, she's a practicing psychiatrist. So she is a scientist, but she's very applied because she works with real patients. I have to say I took great delight in discovering the title of her most recent book, Brainwashed, The Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience. The many jokes in that title, or references in that title, is quite impressive. Scott Soames is our philosopher. He's a distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of Southern California. He specializes in the philosophy of language and the history of analytic philosophy. More interestingly is as he defines the specifics of his research. I can't even begin to touch some of these points here. Truth, vagueness, and the relationship between semantics and pragmatics. It's daunting, to say the least. And then there's, of course, John DiIulio. Many of you already know John, and Bill Crystal just gave a fine introduction of him moments ago. I will add that I have to say John is one of my favorite people for his keen intellect, for his courage, but most significantly for the size of his heart. John is a leading academic who cares deeply not just about studying a problem, but trying to identify solutions, and I do appreciate that about John. Each of the panelists will give a presentation. We'll move into a question or two for the panel, and then we will open it up to the wider audience. So I think we'll start with Scott.
Okay, thank you. I've brought with me my copy of The Moral Sense, which I bought in, I think, 1995 or 1996. And on the back, as I was looking at it again in preparation for this panel, I noticed a quote from Irving Kristol. And this is, I'll start by reading it. James Q. Wilson has done the impossible. He's written a lucid work of social science that actually illuminates such topics as gender differences, family dynamics, the origins of our moral sentiments, and why the human animal is the way he or she is. This book is a masterpiece, and it will be a classic. I want to call your attention to three aspects of his remarks. First, he characterizes the book as a work of social science, which I believe it is. Second, he characterizes it as a masterpiece, which I believe it is. Third, he says it will be a classic. Now, to become a classic, it must become an indispensable source of reference, and it must initiate some kind of tradition in one or another or many fields. And one of the issues I want to raise here in my discussion is to what extent that is true. Now, like John and Shep, who had reappraisals of the book when they reread it for this session, I too had my own reappraisal of the book when I reread it for this session. I loved the book when I read it, but as a philosopher, I thought, oh, that's interesting, social science. I didn't regard it as a work of philosophy. I now regard it as a very important philosophical book. Its importance has not, unfortunately, been recognized in my discipline, so it's not a classic in philosophy, but I think I can see a way in which it will become an important work in my discipline, and I hope to be able to play a part in making that so. Now, my discipline, philosophy. One of the things that happened in 20th century was that philosophy, like virtually every other discipline, became far, far too big for any single mind. Philosophy, like many of the disciplines, became highly specialized. Indeed, most of the subdisciplines are too big for a single mind. So, what are philosophers supposed to do? One might have thought that they're supposed to produce grand syntheses which bring everything together. One doesn't find that very much in the 20th century, and certainly as the 20th century has worn on, one doesn't find it very much. One finds it in particular areas, but not a grand synthesis. Well, what happens is we now have a lot of subdomains. Philosophy of physics is studied by philosophers who are often closer to theoretical physicists than they are to their philosophical colleagues in their own department. We have the theory of knowledge, which has been central since Plato, but now people who study it study not only the philosophical tradition, but they're heavily involved with probability theory, interpretations of probability, Bayesian probability, and the like. We have the philosophy of rational action, anyone who goes into that field today deals heavily in decision theory and interacts with economists and a variety of other people. We have my own main discipline, which is the philosophy of language, and this makes a contribution to the emerging sciences of language and information studied by psychologists, logicians, and a great many other theorists by trying to articulate what a piece of information is, such that it both can fit into our mental economy, but also represent the world in the way that information does. So there's a lot of crosstalk between philosophy and other main intellectual advances and projects in the world today. There's less talk to the general educated public, and in some fields of philosophy, particularly normative ethics, there's been a far too isolated approach that has been taken. Most people working in philosophy, in normative ethics, haven't seen how to combine their conceptual analysis and understanding with empirical advances, for example, in the social sciences or in the natural sciences. Now, I wonder whether people in sociology or political science have done better than we have in philosophy in taking this book as an example of how these things can be combined. At present in philosophy, there are no commentaries on this book. I think there soon will be, but there aren't. And one thing I'd like to know is, within the social sciences, has there been a tradition in which this is the beginning, in which more and more and more and more advanced work of this type has been developed? I simply don't know, and maybe John will tell us. But I want to tell you today, just sketch, very briefly, how I think Jim Wilson's work can profitably count as philosophy and point us in a direction so that philosophers and social scientists can work together. Let me start by just noticing that in section 1 of The Moral Sense, Wilson advances the thesis that we have a moral sense that is the product of our innate endowment and our earliest family experiences. That's section 1 of chapter 1. What is section 2 of chapter 1 titled? It's titled Morality versus Philosophy. And it begins with these words. At one time, the view that our sense of morality shaped our behavior and judgments was widely held among philosophers. Aristotle said that man is naturally a social being that seeks happiness. Thomas Aquinas argued that man has a natural inclination to be a rational and familial being. The moral law is, in the first instance, an expression of a natural, that is, innate tendency. Adam Smith wrote that man is motivated by sympathy as well as by self-interest. And he developed a moral philosophy squarely based on the capacity for sympathy. But, says Wilson, modern philosophy represents a fundamental break with that tradition. He's right. The philosophy of the 20th century did break with that tradition. But it seems to me that Wilson may not have understood why. Marx and Rorty, whom he cites, were very largely irrelevant, I think. Ayers' 1936 view that because moral statements are unverifiable, they're merely ejaculations or commands, didn't last. Now, in my time, I'll try to sketch why the break between philosophy and morality occurred, how the break is connected to the larger cultural diminishment of morality that Wilson deplores, and how his social scientific approach addresses both the philosophical and the cultural diminishment of morality in the last 100 years. The tradition of Aristotle, Aquinas, and Smith recognized the existence of moral facts, knowledge of which provided reasons for action. The philosophers who broke with the tradition did so because they believed the questions, what are moral facts and how do they provide us with reasons for action, can't be answered. A moral fact, they contended, must provide a reason for all relevantly situated rational agents to act in a certain way. The authority of morality is tied to the generality of these reasons. Many facts provide reasons for acting, without themselves being moral facts. The fact that my local football team is playing in town may give me a reason to attend in order to support them, but only if I'm interested in doing that. Since not everybody shares my interest, and there's no reason why they should, that fact is, of course, not a moral fact. A moral fact must provide reasons for actions that aren't conditional in this way. If you're morally obligated to do something, your obligation isn't conditional on having any renounceable interest or sentiment or preference. Well, do any facts provide categorical rather than merely conditional reasons for action? Consider 3 candidate facts. The fact that lying or breaking a promise subverts the very trust that makes one's lie or promise possible. One fact. Second fact, the fact that one who shirks one's share of a burden of a collective effort from which one benefits asks others to do something that one refuses to do oneself. Another candidate for being a moral fact. The third candidate, the fact that securing a modest benefit to oneself may, in some case, harms others. Those will all count as moral facts if they provide reasons for all agents to refrain from the behavior. Do they provide reasons? Imagine a rational being who lacks concern for others, who expertly calculates benefits for himself, and who always acts accordingly. Because the 3 facts I've just mentioned are unconnected with that agent's goals, they won't in and of themselves count as reasons for him. Of course, a race of relentless interest maximizers might sometimes need to cooperate to achieve mutually beneficial ends. In those cases, they may behave cooperatively. But they won't, I think, behave morally, because genuine affection, loyalty, trust, reciprocity, openness, and obligation will be absent from their actions. Now, that little thought experiment shows that some facts we commonly take to be moral facts don't provide reasons, not even prima facie reasons, for all conceivable rational agents to act. So the next question is, how do they provide us with binding reasons to act? How do facts that can be known without taking any particular motivational stance towards them, facts with no necessary connection to ultimate interests of the knower, count as genuinely moral? Couldn't you and I know my 3 facts while understanding our individual interests perfectly well without taking them to provide us with any sorts of reasons for action? If the answer to this question is yeah, of course, then the idea that we have genuine other regarding duties in the sense of Aristotle, Aquinas, and Kant, duties that can't be shirked by adopting different motivating interests, is a fairy tale. That more or less is what many 20th century philosophers believed, but Wilson didn't. Rather, he set out to find, using social science, the basis in human nature from which genuine duties do arise. But look, you might ask, how could he possibly succeed? Since reasons for rational action must depend on motivating interests that can, in principle, vary from one rational agent to another, no mere facts can provide all such agents with reasons, even prima facie reasons, to perform other regarding actions. In short, there is no objective morality that binds all possible rational agents. That conclusion was, I think, plausibly taken to be a conceptual truth by many 20th century philosophers. And if it's a conceptual truth, then it can't be overridden by science or anything else. So where in moral philosophy do we go from there? That was the problem the 20th century struggled with for such a long time. Well, where do we go from there? I think we start by recognizing that there's more to morality than rationality. We don't need an objective morality for all possible rational beings. We do need an objective morality for normal, rational human beings. Now, if Wilson is right, our genetic endowment, our early family experience, and the unalterable circumstances of the human condition provide us with a motivational base that ties us by bonds of affection, social affiliation, and mutual interest to our fellows. That's the raw material that will ultimately generate reasons for other regarding action, the authority of which can, in principle, be recognized by normal human beings. Now, of course, to specify in any precise terms what these reasons are and what specific actions they enjoin is to construct a moral code which goes far beyond what Wilson attempted. His job was to show that such a construction is in principle possible by demonstrating a naturalistic basis, which he calls the moral sense, on which an objective morality can be founded. Now, in doing his job, of course, he repudiated Freud and embraced Darwin. Because cooperation promotes survival, we've been bred by natural selection to be social animals. It's not just that we need and want what others can provide and so are forced by self-interest to depend on them. We're also disposed to form powerful cognitive and emotional attachments to other people. Parents are innately disposed to protect, nourish, and love their children. Children naturally love, imitate, and emulate their parents and others with whom they are intimate. As children, we form reciprocal bonds of affection and trust in which our well-being is intertwined with theirs. Entering into games and collective activities with others, we learn the rudiments of fairness, which involves adhering to common rules and earning rewards proportionate to the value of our efforts. That fusion of natural sentiment with rational principles gives birth to morality. Sentiment infuses our participation in games and collective activities with those we like and admire, and whom we wish to be liked and admired by. Often these individuals will be models of the people we hope to become. The accepted rules governing our activities with them are often impersonal principles that apply to anyone who occupies a given role in the effort. Because these rules define the commonly acceptable terms of participation in a mutually beneficial undertaking, it's in the self-interest of each participant to obey them. But they are much more than mere prudential directives. Because participants are often comrades, bound by ties of social affiliation, rule violations carry psychic risks beyond the loss of purely self-interested benefits secured by participation. Violations of the rules governing interactions with one's socially affiliated fellows, what are they? They're affronts to one's comrades, to one's friendship with them, to one's image in their eyes, and to the person one wants oneself to be. With this, instrumentally useful rules obeyed to secure the benefits of group action become principles to be honored even when no one is looking. This is the crucial point at which sentiment, social affiliation, and recognition of mutual interest are incorporated into broad principles of general application that constitute the core of morality. Now, this account of how Wilson's moral sense may generate embryonic moral principles, defining obligations to family and friends, is, of course, only the beginning. Much more is needed to explain how broader obligations are generated to one's community, to one's country, and even to all human beings. And indeed, in the second to last chapter of The Moral Sense, Wilson begins that task. Now, I think the task can be accomplished only by recognizing, first, that we are beings that construct our own identities in relation to others. Second, that in doing this, we often must rely on others for guidance about what? About who we are and whom we wish to become. And third, that the most successful way to secure this guidance requires being open to and caring about others and trusting them to feel similarly about us. And fourth, that to build the relationships we need to internalize and to be seen as internalizing basic rules of reciprocity that encompass not only the ancient principles, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but also its corollary. Be the kind of person that you want and expect other people to be. Well, that, in a very, very short space, is my sketch of a philosophically defensible construction of an objective morality based on Wilson's moral sense. But look, more is at stake than abstract philosophy. The cultural conception of morality, which changed radically in the 20th century, is, I think, also at stake. Today, the leading transmitters of culture in the West, the universities, the news media, the entertainment industry, among them, have largely given up on morality as a domain of objective fact, the knowledge of which can be advanced by reasoned argument, informed by the empirical study of human nature. As my late colleague Dallas Willard put it, they have given up on the reality of genuine moral knowledge. These cultural institutions haven't, of course, given up their moral passions. The passions are far too deep to be given up. But because they no longer believe in moral knowledge, they don't subject our moral passions, or theirs, to the rational scrutiny those passions require. By removing reasoned argument and scientific inquiry from the equation, they have coarsened our passions, made them more unreasonable, generated intolerance where there should be civility, and deprived us of the best means of enhancing our moral sense, which really must be enhanced. This cultural phenomenon is, I think, what concerned Wilson in the section of chapter 1 that is titled, "Is Everything Permitted?" Of course, everything isn't permitted. But it's important to know and to explain why it isn't. And I think Wilson made a real contribution to this effort. So the intent of my little sketch of how genuine moral obligation can arise from the innate moral sense Wilson identifies is to illustrate how I hope in the future philosophers and social scientists together might use his work as a starting point for combating the cultural diminishment of morality that he so deplored.
Susan, I'll key off the question that you set out as a framing one, which is how do we know about human nature and behavior? And the more specific question I want to address, one I also did in my book, Brainwashed, was can we come to know this through knowledge of the brain? So keep that aside. I'll get back to that in a more concrete way. But I want to start out by talking a little bit about the moral sense in terms of how it holds up today through the lens of social psychology research. The book was written in the early 90s and I'm sure conceived in the mid-80s in a time of creeping moral relativism. But Wilson wrote in defense of judgment, and in particular of humans' natural predispositions to form moral assessments. His argument would still hold up, or his observation and arguments would still hold up very nicely today. Cross-cultural data continue to support a universal sense of fairness. Across human cultures, individuals tend to react with quick, automatic feelings of anger, contempt, and indignation when they see people causing suffering and when acts go unreciprocated. The universality of these responses strongly suggests that intuitions about fairness are built into the human mind by evolution. Even young children, too, children that are way too young to have been schooled in moral discourse by their parents or society. Developmental psychologists have demonstrated the capacity of even infants to make certain types of moral judgments, such as distinguishing between actors, good and bad, and circumstances that adults would recognize as good and bad, kind and cruel, and equal and unfair. My friend Paul Bloom at Yale has done and continues to do incredible work in his infant development lab in that regard. Also, Wilson has been vindicated on the notion of moral foundations. In his book, he elaborated 4 basic foundations: sympathy, fairness, self-control, and duty. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt, whose recent book was The Righteous Mind, a very, very important book, I think, where he identified through copious social psychological survey data what he would call 6 moral foundations. And he considers them to be like the innate taste buds of the moral sense. And he positions them on axes. So one of the 6 axes is the care-harm axis. Another is fairness-cheating axis. The third, in terms of its opposite, again, is liberty-oppression. 5th would be loyalty and betrayal. Fifth, that is authority and subversion. And the last one he identified as sanctity and degradation. And you can walk through these, and Wilson's pillars also correspond nicely to Haidt's mapping. For example, Wilson's sympathy foundation corresponds nicely with Haidt's care-harm foundation, which stems from the attachment systems we share with other primates and likely underlies virtues of kindness, gentleness, and nurturance. William's fairness pretty much matches Haidt's fairness, a concern that can be traced to evolutionary preserved processes of reciprocal altruism. You take care of me, I take care of yours, which gives rise to ideas of justice, proportionality, and rights. Haidt's authority subversion axis and loyalty betrayal axes may be collapsed into Wilson's sense of duty. And self-control, which is the only one of Wilson's foundations that doesn't fit neatly into Haidt's scheme, does have some overlap with Haidt's sanctity degradation foundation, to the extent that they both relate to treating one's body with respect and resisting carnal or other base urges. So Wilson's commitment to the idea of inborn moral substrate is largely consistent with the work of experimental psychology since about the 80s. As you can imagine, there are volumes written. I've just condensed it tremendously. So consistent with their work and also the work of evolutionary biologists. At the same time, however, Wilson was very leery of the implications of biological or genetic determinism. And as I believe, he just began to add neurodeterminism to that list of concepts against which he would soon push back against. So, and in fact, he asked in a 2010 article in National Affairs called, I love this title, called The Future of Blame, he asked, will understanding human behavior at the level of genetics and neurobiology make it unreasonable or impossible to hold people accountable for what they do? His answer, you might expect, was no, and rightly so in my view. In fact, I think one of the most important lessons in this century of the brain, Bush called 90s the decade of the brain, but I think it's fair to say we're in the century of the brain, is that biological explanations of behavior can very much coexist with understandings of virtue and expectations of virtue. Now, it's only natural that advances in knowledge about the brain would make us think more mechanistically about ourselves. And certainly that's true. And the better we get at generating brain-based explanations of behavior, and we get better every day, you just have to open up the page, if you're the science pages of your newspaper, and there are brain scans, stunning brain scans, which are incidentally a just magnificent technology, staring back at you. So we're getting much, much better, again, even though we're still in its infancy, getting much, much better at generating neurobiological and other biological explanations of behavior. And that fact makes it even more incumbent on us to understand or think about the implications of these new findings for our understanding of personal, civic, and criminal responsibility. So let's take drug addicts. I know them fairly intimately because I work part-time in a methadone clinic. And I've been writing about this for a long time. And one of the most, I would say a pretty impressive demonstration is one where you could take a cocaine addict and put him or her in an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, which generates those very, very dramatic pictures of areas in the brain where there's increased activity when a person has certain experiences or performs certain tasks. So you show the addict and you can do this through little goggles, but you'd show a picture of other people using cocaine or heroin, and this is something that is intrinsically appealing to most people who've had positive experiences with drugs. They will report wanting to, craving it themselves, would like to use the drug themselves if they could. They find, and that is reflected in increased neural activity in what we call the reward circuitry. And it's really, from a technological standpoint, that's very, very brilliant. The problem is that in some quarters, that kind of visual representation, that biological portraiture, has been held up because, of course, here we see something in the brain as evidence that the behavior that flows from that experience, that subjective experience of craving, was involuntary or unavoidable. And that is not a reasonable inference to make. It's reasonable to say it might be harder for such a person to resist use, but not impossible. And in fact, the work by Mark Kleiman and Angela Hawkins, as they'll describe, I would think, shows how addicts, in fact, flourish. Their brains are as lit as Christmas trees, but while they are held accountable. Clearly, addicts have changed brains. Why else would people use drugs if they didn't have some kind of effect on one's mental state, a rewarding effect? But the point is that these changes, unlike the changes, say, of Alzheimer's disease or things we call classic brain diseases, do not preclude the capacity to respond to incentives or other contingencies. Even more profound in the neurobiological discourse these days is the alleged threat posed by neuroscience to the very idea of moral agency. And extremely smart people say this, and they're so smart I go back, wonder if I'm wrong, because one is Robert Sapolsky. Maybe some of you know him. He's such a brilliant and wonderful biologist at Stanford. And I'm quoting him. He says, "Our growing knowledge about the brain makes notions of volition, culpability, and ultimately the very premise of our criminal justice system deeply suspect." Then two other academics, again, who I respect very much, a philosopher and neuroscientist named Joshua Green at Harvard and his Princeton colleague Jonathan Cohen, contend that neuroscience has a special role to play in giving age-old arguments, and by that he means hard determinism, arguments about free will, more rhetorical bite. And to quote them, "The new neuroscience will affect the way we view the law. It can help us see that all behavior is mechanical, that all behavior is produced by chains of physical events that ultimately reach back to forces beyond the agent's control." Other neuroscientists hope to see a general attitude of a shift from, quote, a quote, shift from blame to biology. Not only is it unclear that this is a laudable goal, although there are circumstances in which it is, but certainly not as a blanket application. The relationship between brain-based explanations of behavior and what they mean for holding people accountable is not at all straightforward. I mean, everyone believes that people can be held accountable only if they have freedom of choice, which of course is why we don't sue children or animals anymore, or people who are demented. But there is a long-standing metaphysical debate, clearly, about the kind of freedom that is necessary to be held accountable. Some contend, I happen to be in this camp, and I believe James Q. Wilson was, but right, Roberta? Held accountable as long as we are able to engage in conscious deliberation, follow rules, and generally control ourselves. This is certainly the view of the legal system. It doesn't care why somebody committed a crime. If they had bad genes, bad parents, or bad stars, it doesn't care that a long chain of genetic, childhood, environmental causes were not under the control of an individual that lead up to the brain activity immediately preceding the moment of, say, a murder. This doesn't undermine the law's capacity and duty to blame and punish, unless, of course, there is a defect of rationality and hence a not guilty by reason of insanity defense or extreme duress as excusing factors. I'm not talking about mitigating now, I'm talking about excusing. But others, like those like Sapolsky and Green and Cohen, for example, insists that even though we do deliberate and decide, they don't challenge that people are deciding creatures, but they will say that we're still not free because we are dictated by neuronal circumstances. People are truly not choosing. They are victims of neuronal circumstances. In fact, that's their quotation. And this is the classic hard determinism debate you've all heard. If you don't have ultimate freedom, you can't be held morally accountable, whereas others, and I'm in this camp, believe if you have ordinary responsibility, you can be held accountable. But the implications of the hard determinist stance, which has been around for centuries, is that we would be then compelled to adopt a strictly utilitarian model of justice dedicated solely to preventing crime through deterrence, through incapacitation, and through rehabilitation, which are 3 of the 4 pillars of our criminal justice system, but of course they leave out retribution. The concept of desert is incoherent in their view. People don't deserve to be blamed, and they don't deserve to be punished either. So as Wilson understood this free will question, and again, I would define the free will question as how you reconcile moral agency in a world of caused behaviors. And I believe that our behaviors are caused. I don't believe they're random. I don't believe in a dualist view. But I do believe they can be reconciled. Anyway, but I don't have the answer. And certainly our book, we did not set out for a minute to presume to even answer such a question. It remains one of the great conceptual impasses of all time. And it is beyond the capacity, I believe, of brain science to resolve this. That's a philosophical question. What kinds of freedom you consider adequate in order to hold people accountable? Now, unless investigators can show something truly spectacular, which is that people are not conscious at all, and they're because the ideas we're conscious and our actions flow from reason, and we are responsive to reason. As I said before, if there's a problem, a severe problem with that, you may get off in a court of law because you're insane. But that is an exception. Again, in the lens of Sapolsky and Green, no one's responsible, not merely people with brain defects. Anyway, this is not a question for neuroscience to answer unless it can show we're not conscious at all, and so far we haven't made much progress there.
You don't know some of the people I know, but that's all right. That's okay.
Well, I was about to say, true, we do not exert as much conscious control over our actions as we think we do. And someone mentioned behavioral economics. That's a nice example. And certainly every student of the mind, beginning notably with William James and Sigmund Freud, know this. I even believe a little bit in the dynamic unconscious, but certainly there's a heuristic unconscious, and we engage in implicit application of implicit knowledge and perception all the time. Nevertheless, the fact that we're not as conscious as we think we are doesn't mean we are powerless. And in fact, deliberative reasoning is a crucial aspect of moral psychology, a fact that's been way too downplayed. And we can thank Malcolm Gladwell, I think, for that, and Blink, and the popularization of the idea that we really don't deliberate at all, and and basically we make up. I'm sure you've heard this before, but this notion that we basically impute meaning to our actions after the fact. Now, sometimes we do, but this is not how the human mind works all the time. And when stakes are high, we apply a lot of analytic reason. So I'll wind up by saying the beliefs that discoveries in neuroscience will threaten morality seem unrealistic. After all, as I mentioned earlier, the high degree of consensus across cultures regarding the value of proportionate punishment suggests that human intuitions about fairness and justice are just too deeply entrenched, that babies too young to have absorbed social rules from their parents still behave as if guided by some of these foundations, supports that these instincts, intuitions, are so deeply rooted in evolution and psychology that neuroscientific revelations, no matter what, are unlikely to dislodge them easily, if at all. Now, ultimately, that's an empirical matter. If we can change our basic thinking about fairness and justice. But if we can't, it's not because people are immune to change. On the contrary, attitudes shift over time, and recent history certainly bears this out, as we witness profound moral transformations ranging from the abolition of slavery to the endorsement of same-sex marriage. In fact, these milestones of moral progress would not have come about but for the universal hunger for fairness and justice. If we know what do we lose if we don't punish people? And punish in proportion, of course. Otherwise, we are talking about revenge, which is not acceptable. But if we no longer brand certain actions as blameworthy and punish transgressors in proportion to their crimes, we forgo precious opportunities to reaffirm the dignity of victims and to inculcate a shared vision of a just society. As Wilson has written, if we allow ourselves to think that explaining behavior justifies it, virtue then becomes just as meaningless as depravity, a state of affairs in which no society could hope to remain ordered or healthy. So, to the answer that Dean Wilburn asked me at the beginning, which is what kind of light is brain science shedding on our understanding of the moral sense? I would say for public policy purposes, for practical purposes, no light at all. I know that sounds sort of harsh, doesn't it? But we'll discuss. For clinical purposes, certainly understanding the neural mechanisms that go awry in the course of human development as a result of head trauma, even as the result of severe childhood deprivation, that knowledge, and we're coming to learn more and more about this, may guide us in reparative treatments, and that, of course, will be all to the good. But the knowledge of studying the brain is about mechanism. That is about how the mind works. But the mind is about meaning, and those are very important differences that sometimes I think gets elided among my neuroscientific colleagues. So how the brain works is, I think, has been fairly called the last scientific frontier. It's magnificent, it's in its infancy, and it will bear amazing fruits, there's no question. But no matter how much we learn about the brain, it's not going to be able to tell us what to value in society. Thank you very much.
Well, first, I want to apologize for what my evil twin said on the previous panel. Bill actually pointed out last night, Bill Galston, that I can't say this is my evil twin because it supposes that there's a non-evil twin. So Bill got that right. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just try to address the question, what did Jim Wilson know and how did he know it? And I'm going to try to do it very succinctly as we get some time for discussion. I'm not a philosopher, don't pretend to be. In fact, Scott went my first year at Penn, sat in on a philosophy course. It was the Philosophy 101 course. And I think it was the second lecture, the professor said, all knowledge, all that we call knowledge is vague, cocksure, self-contradictory. We can't even know that we're here. And so I left. And, but apparently the registrar knew. And I got an academic progress report, so I figured that.
I don't blame you.
There you go. Jim Wilson was, I think, 3 or 4 things. He was an intellectual, a modernist, and a moralist. I'll keep the list short. And each of those things is, I think, really important to understanding Jim the way I think he is there for us to understand him, although I don't think we have a full understanding of him just yet. He is a thinker of note. I don't know that the book is yet a classic, or his whole corpus can be considered of importance, but I believe that people could and should and perhaps will be studying James Q. Wilson's work long after Much else that was written at the same time in the same fields is no longer being paid much attention to. Intellectual is not a little word here. Jim Wilson was interested in ideas, and he was interested in ideas for ideas' sake. And you can be interested in ideas, but still be the kind of person that doesn't need to explain things in order to take action and lead a happy, well-adjusted life. If the problem is arson and what makes for arsonists, I'm interested too in whatever complex psychology or whatever the explanations are behind that, but my first order of business is to deprive the arsonist of matches. Jim too would say the same, but unlike Jim Wilson, I'd be happy to make sure he doesn't have matches and then go have a wonderful meal. Jim would ponder and puzzle over why people, other things being equal, some become arsonists and some don't. Jim needed to explain things. Jim was interested in understanding and explaining behavior. And it's not just in bureaucracy. You can go all the way back to Jim's earliest works, his work with Ed Banfield and city politics. There's this constant refrain about how it's just, this book is just there to help you understand things, and understanding is its own reward. So he was interested in ideas and symbols and abstractions, the way capital I intellectuals are. And he didn't limit himself to one kind of question. Jim asked empirical questions, from the mundane, the prosaic, to the complicated. Jim was interested in, although it wasn't a field that he practiced, he was interested in formal questions. I mean, he knew the square root of 16, but he was interested in formal and mathematical models and theories. He thought that sometimes, at least, they had some things to contribute. We talked the first panel about, came up several times, Jim's interest in Aristotle. I mean, Jim, I think, had an understanding that, empirical and formal questions differ from maybe certain other kinds of questions that may be in some sense no less real. I'm not going to lump them together as just all philosophical questions, but an empirical question or a formal question, if it's properly constructed, tells you where to look for the answer, right? And an empirical or formal question, presumably, there is one correct answer to such questions. The answer is in principle knowable, and all the answers to all the empirical formal questions once known will be consistent with each other. Not necessarily the case for what might be called another category, whether you call them philosophical. What is justice? What is the purpose of life? Why are we here? Where's my next meal coming from? And Jim would look to Aristotle for what Aristotle was good for. So Aristotle's Politics was still good, even Book 5, because you could read Sam Huntington's Political Order and Changing Societies from 1968, and learn about political development, but you also could read Book 5 of the Politics, and there's still a lot of very interesting stuff there. Aristotle's Physics, that would be of merely antiquarian interest. Thus does alchemy become chemistry and so forth. So Jim was interested in questions of an empirical and formal character, but he was a scientist in his intellectual capacity. Jim approached things with the notion that probably, not always, probably the best to be said about any given question is the latest. The best which has been said, thought, or done about these kinds of questions tends to be, as is true in science, it's cumulative. You build knowledge. You learn what's not true. You falsify things. You move on. Jim was also, in his intellectual capacity, a theorist. I mean, again, he would often deny this book has neither no theoretical value and so forth. But he was a theorist. And everybody here who was a student of Jim's had to memorize the same definition of theory. I'm going to put Professor Melnick on. No, I want to spot a statement about the relationship between two or more variables that are supposed to hold under specified conditions. And you could wake them up in the middle of the night, and you have to know that. Jim believed that theory was important, and he thought that some theories were more powerful and parsimonious than others. And he put a great deal. He was derisive of people who would say, "Well, I have a piece of evidence, and this doesn't count. This doesn't reinforce your notion of that relationship." And he'd say, "Well, all theories have unassimilated data. I mean, supply and demand's a pretty good theory, but it doesn't explain everything, right? There are backward bending supply curves and complex economic equilibria you don't learn until you get your doctoral degree in economics or whatnot." And but Jim understood that, and so theory is can you explain as much or more based on as few or fewer simplifying assumptions? That was Jim's idea of theory, and so his intellectual life was very much the life of a person that was interested in empirical and formal questions, very much the life of the mind, the theorist, and in this capacity, Jim was also prima facie a modernist. Now, what do I mean by that? And it's sort of obvious, like, well, how could a guy who's getting a doctoral degree at the University of Chicago in the mid-20th century not be a modernist, especially if he's in the social sciences? Jim, like virtually everyone else at that period, and even now, of course, relegated many other traditional ways of knowing to sort of a limbo of lesser significance. Mysticism, revelation, divination, that's all, that's then. Now it's science, it's inductivism, it's empiricism, it's rational thought, and so on. He was very much, at every inch, the modernist. He had his notions, both as intellectual and modernist, about what did and did not advance the cause of understanding. And we heard about that in the first panel. He had a great deal of regard, actually, for economics and economic models and understandings. But when I came to Harvard, I came to Harvard after I did a master's and bachelor's degree in my major was economics and public policy, and then political science was sort of the second discipline. And so I was very mathed up for my day when I came to Harvard. And I thought if I was going to write in the end about prison management or prisons, I would write something under the heading, The Determinants of Prison Order, which Jim was very encouraging of, but he thought it was a much less rich and interesting topic than one where you would get natural experiments in the data and try to look at the world and figure out how it was like, in a much more complex and, as it turned out, more challenging empirical. So it wasn't that he didn't believe in it, he just thought it was less interesting in the end. By the same token, Jim was very much of the mind that, as we heard this morning, the natural sciences had a great deal to contribute and understand, and thought it was just a blind spot of people, sort of disciplinary chauvinism or triumphalism, that they didn't pay attention to all the other people who were out there asking empirical and formal questions with different methods in different fields. But let me come to this third category, and then I'll turn my motor off. Jim was a moralist. But again, he was also a modern intellectual. He was a modernist and he was an intellectual. This was I think it's a tension in his work. And I think it's one that even in his last few years, he was kind of thinking about as he thought about everything and trying to resolve. Let me put it to you this way. Let me put it to you the way I put it to Jim in one of our conversations, one of the conversations we had in the last couple of years that Jim was with us. We were going back and forth about, I won't bore you with all the little details, but I said to him, look, what if we come at it this way? About 13 billion years ago, give or take, before evolution by selection, the Big Bang kicks up quarks, radiation, stardust, on the road to creating gravity-clumped inanimate matter. And by sheer cosmic accident, lo and behold, we big-brained, carbon-based, and apparently morally sensible forms of life emerge in this third-rate galaxy with its second-rate sun, which is now T-minus however many billion years from flaming out anyway. So forget about sustainability. You can count on entropy. And on this pitiful little, it's not even like an outer burb of a big neighborhood. I mean, it's a nothing place in the cosmos. We just happen to have this chemical soup that evolves assorted organic beings. We humans, of course, are the ever-popular mammals. And for tens of millions of years, our mammal ancestors ate dinosaur dust. And then by blind nature, the deck gets shuffled, and an asteroid, some say at least believe, hits the Earth. And suddenly everything on land that's more than 50 pounds, and they're definitely my ancestors, all those things that were more than 50 pounds, have a permanent bad hair day. And so now, reptiles out, mammals on the march. And here are our ancestors, the lemurs. They can claim us as their smarter, brawnier legacies. We have a series of lucky accidents. I mean, lucky if you don't count how natural selection then gives us human world-class evildoers, certain brothers-in-law, and the ice capades. But here we are with our so-called moral sense. Hardwired, according to my dear friend and mentor, to call wrong and recoil from wanton acts of brutal violence and the like. So the nearly universal convention against, thou shalt not kill is big almost everywhere, all the time, except among sociopaths and psychopaths or whatever. But to get from that intellectual modernist understanding to a pronouncement that this particular speck of temporary, here today, gone tomorrow, gravity clumped organic matter has anything at all to say about how things ought to be, isn't that terrifically presumptuous, unless you believe that you're not just creatures, but that you're not just, that you are just creatures of a creator. If you're the creator, if you're making it all up, obviously I'm putting into the compass of 16 seconds debate that's been going on for a few millennia, where do we go from here? And why ought we to care? Now, we've heard from, I think, both Scott and Sally that Jim has given us lots of grist for the mill of answering that question, and answering nihilists, and answering relativists. That vegetarianism and cannibalism are not merely different matters of taste, and so forth. But what I'm going to end by saying is, I'm not sure that he did. Near the very end of Jim's life, Jim actually read, I don't know, Roberta, because I don't know if I sent this to him, but I happen to be a big fan of Isaiah Berlin's, and I sent to him, Jim, we were talking, and Jim said, had come across, and actually cited in something he wrote, I can't remember off the top which, Isaiah Berlin's essay on historical inevitability. The oldest free will, all that business. I think if Jim were able to continue in this world, this conversation, I'm not sure that Jim would not have come to still other conclusions or parsed this question in other ways over time. So I think that Jim was, as I say, an intellectual, a modernist, a theorist as an intellectual modernist, but he also wanted to be a moralist without being precisely a philosopher and without being every inch only a natural or social scientist. And he stood at this intersection. And what he left for us, I think, to parse and reflect on, both for public policy schools and for education generally, is perhaps one of the greatest treasures that any intellectual modernist of the 20th century and early 21st century gave us. So, thank you.